Hello. Such fictional truths about the participants are typically generated by the participants themselves. It is because Chris actually places a doll in a plastic bread box that, fictionally, he bathes a baby. It is by virtue of the fact that children gallop around the house, that, fictionally they ride horses in the Wild West. The participants are props as well as objects. They are in these respects like stumps which make it fictional of themselves that they are theirs. In fact, the mere presence of participants in the vicinity of stumps or dolls or other such reflexive props makes it likely that they will function similarly. Props, especially reflexive ones, have a strong propensity to reproduce their kind. If Gregory and Eric declare a stump to be a bear, it is natural, indeed all but inevitable, that they will understand things around it to be props also. If the stump's existence makes it fictional that it is a bear, we almost automatically take its possession of various properties to make it fictional that it is a bear of a certain sort, a large or ferocious one that is rearing up or sitting on its haunches. This holds for relational as well as non-relational properties. The fact that the stump is on a hill makes it fictional that the bear is on a hill. If the stump is surrounded by poison ivy, it is probably fictional that the bear is in the midst of a poison ivy patch. These relational facts are as much facts about the hill and the poison ivy as they are facts about the stump. The hill and the poison ivy generate fictional truths. They are props. The hill, by virtue of having the stump on it, makes it fictional that the bear is on a hill. In this way, props beget props. Props thus begotten are almost always reflexive. It is fictional of the actual hill that the bear is on it. It is the actual patch of poison ivy in which, fictionally, the bear cavorts. Much of the rest of the stump's surroundings are similarly drawn into the game. Hawks or airplanes flying overhead, the clouds in the sky, even a squirrel that lands momentarily on the stump and quickly, frantically scurries away. There are limits, of course. Termites in the stump or skyscrapers and freeways nearby may be ignored. It may be too disruptive to allow that fictionally the bear is termite infested or has an urban habitat. People, too, even mere onlookers, are drawn into the game and listed as reflexive props. If the stump is 10 yards in front of Gregory, this fact about Gregory makes it fictional that the bear is 10 yards in front of him. Likewise, if it is not Gregory but his mother who strays dangerously close to the bear. Comparing participants to the stump and other reflexive props that it recruits, such as the hill and the poison ivy, is fine as far as it goes. But the comparison ignores much of what is important about participants' roles in their games. There is the obvious point that actions Eric and Gregory perform vis-à-vis the stump make it fictional that they perform actions vis-à-vis the bear, often but not necessarily the same ones. If Eric comes across the stump suddenly, fictionally he comes suddenly across the bear. Other of his actions may make it fictional that he catches sight of the bear through the trees, or feeds it, or jumps on its back. He may yell, "Watch out," thereby fictionally warning Gregory of the danger. A participant differs from the stump and many of its progeny also in being a primary focus of interest. It does not especially matter that the particular stump and poison ivy patch in Eric's and Gregory's game are the ones they are. Different ones with similar properties would serve just as well. But that it is Gregory and Eric who are reflexive props does matter notably to Gregory and Eric. Reflexive props can be mere instruments in a game of make-believe, or they can be objects of interest in their own right. Participants fall into the latter category. I suggested that self-elimination is a key function of games of make-believe and other imaginative activities. The role of participants as reflective props has a lot to do with the effectiveness of games of make-believe in this regard. Imaginings about oneself plausibly contribute to self-understanding. Hence the value of fictional truths about the participants, of their being given prescriptions to imagine about themselves. But it is also important, as we shall see, that such fictional truths be generated by the participants themselves, that the participants be props. Participants are in some ways better likened to actors playing themselves in theatrical events than to the stump, the hill, and the poison ivy patch. A game of make-believe bears comparison to a play or movie about Ronald Reagan, in which the part of Reagan is taken by Reagan himself. Reagan is a reflexive representation, generating by his actions as well as his presence fictional truths about himself. No doubt he will be a focus of interest as well. But this comparison sorry. But this comparison too is severely limited. On-stage actors perform for audiences, but children playing make-believe games usually do not. Onlookers, if there are any, may be ignored. The children are not staging a spectacle. They play the game for the sake of playing it for themselves. The point of an ordinary play about Reagan, no matter who does the acting, is to entertain or edify or illuminate spectators. The point of Eric's and Gregory's game is to entertain or edify themselves or to provide themselves with insight partly about themselves. Eric and Gregory are the interested parties as well as the objects of interest. The means by which Reagan is referred to and thus made an object of representation are very different from those by which Eric and Gregory are. The character Reagan plays bears his name. The theatrical event corresponds substantially to him. It may be fictional that the character was a Hollywood movie actor who continued his career as the 40th President of the United States. The author may have inserted an explanatory footnote in the script. These are just the sorts of circumstances which in other cases establish that an actor portrays an actual person other than himself. In our example, it happens that the person to whom they point is the actor himself. The fact that Reagan is the actor has little, if anything, to do with making him the object of representation. An understudy who takes over his role would portray Reagan just as surely as Reagan himself did. But it is because Gregory is a player in the game of make-believe that he is also its object. If Sam should take his place in the game, it would be fictional that Sam, not Gregory, confronts a bear in the woods. Since Gregory's representing role in his game is what makes him the object of representation, one can hardly fail to realize the identifier of object and prop as one might in the case of the play about Reagan. Participants in games of make-believe are thus props, objects, and imaginers, all three, intimately combined in one neat package. They prescribe imaginings that are about themselves by virtue of the fact that they themselves do the prescribing, and it is to themselves that they issue the prescriptions. Not only is the participant to imagine about himself, he is to do so in a first-person manner, in the sense illustrated in 1.4. Eric does not just imagine of someone whom he knows to be himself that that person confronts a bear and stands his ground or flees or whatever. He imagines confronting the bear and standing his ground or fleeing. And he imagines this from the inside. We might say that he imaginatively confronts a bear. In general, participation involves imagining from the inside, doing and experiencing things. Imagining bathing babies, riding horses, driving trucks. Even this does not fully capture the participant's experience, however. It omits the place of the actual activities in the content of his imaginings. His coming upon a stump, his dunking a doll, his galloping astride a stick are themselves reflexive props in the game and objects of his imaginings. He imagines of his sighting a stump that it is an instance of his sighting a bear, of his dunking the doll that in doing this he is bathing a baby, and so on. Suppose Reagan watches from the audience as an understudy, taking his part, portrays the president making a speech. Reagan imagines that Reagan is giving a speech, and he realizes, probably, that the person he is imagining is none other than himself. He imagines, moreover, of the actor's performance that it is an instance of his Reagan speaking. But this self-imagining is not done in a first-person manner. He's probably not imagining giving a speech, and he's certainly not imagining from the inside doing so. He might, of course, retreat into a reverie prompted by the performance, and imagine thus. But this imagining, though from the inside, will not be an imagining of the actor's actions that they are an instance of his giving a speech. Participants in games of make-believe, being at once reflexive props and imaginers, imagine of the actual representing actions that they are instances of their doing things, and they imagine this from the inside. Appreciators as participants. We should expect viewers of paintings and films, spectators of plays, readers of novels and stories to participate in the games in which these works are props, much as children participate in games of cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, dolls and mud pies. They do. There are differences, to be sure, important ones, but they must not be allowed to obscure the underlying similarities. Appreciation of representational works of art is primarily a matter of participation. It is not only as participants that we are interested in representations, however. Critics and historians of the arts, insofar as they are not appreciators also, may be more onlookers than participants. And even appreciation does not always involve participation, as we shall see. My suggestion is that the primary or central instances of appreciation do, and that those which do not are nevertheless to be understood largely in terms of participation. Given my earlier conclusion that representations have the function of serving as props in games of make-believe, it can hardly be controversial that appreciators normally participate in the minimal sense of considering themselves subject of the rules of make-believe, constrained to imagine as the works prescribe. What is not so obvious, but of very considerable importance, is that viewers and readers are reflexive props in these games, that they generate fictional truths about themselves. Many of their actions, like those of participants in children's games, are reflexive props as well. And as in the case of participants in children's games, it is in the first person manner that appreciators are to and do imagine about themselves. They imagine from the inside, doing things and undergoing experiences. Support for thinking of appreciation in this way will come gradually. In the present section, I present some preliminary considerations in its favor, but its strongest confirmation will consist not in direct arguments about, but in its contribution to a systematic and satisfying overall picture of representation, and its capacity to unravel puzzles, resolve paradoxes, and penetrate mysteries. I observed that imagining something in the sense we are interested in seems to involve, perhaps necessarily, imagining oneself believing or knowing it. So, an appreciator who participates in a game in the minimal sense of imagining what is fictional will engage in self imaginings as well. It should not be surprising that, when the appreciator recognizes that P is fictional and imagines believing or knowing that P, as well as P itself, it is fictional that he believes or knows that P. This fictional truth can be understood to be generated. Not sure, can be understood to be generated by his realization that P is fictional, or possibly by his imagining as he does. Thus, the appreciator is a reflexive prop in his game. But appreciators' roles as reflexive props go much further than this, although in different ways for works of different kinds. Gulliver's Travels makes it fictional of itself that it is the journal of a certain ship's physician, Lemuel Gulliver. It is almost inevitable that in reading it, one should understand it to be fictional that one is reading such a journal. The novel, itself a reflexive representation, thus draws people into games of make-believe in much the way that Eric's and Gregory slums do. The museum goer who looks at Willem van der Velde's landscape shore at Scheveningen in the normal manner makes it fictional of himself that he is looking a group of sailing ships approaching a beach on which there is a horse-drawn cart. The painting is not a reflexive prop like Gulliver's Travels, but it too draws the appreciator into a game. Here is a quick consideration in support of this claim. The viewer, let's call him Stephen, might remark, on examining the painting, I see several sailing ships, and in much the same spirit as that in which he might say, there are several sailing ships offshore. If, as seems likely, the latter is to be understood as prefaced implicitly by something like it is fictional that, probably the former is to be understood similarly as the assertion that fictionally he sees several sailing ships. It would seem that in making either of these remarks, Stephen is expressing a truth. So it seems to be fictional not only that there are several sailing ships offshore, but also that Stephen sees them. His looking at the picture makes this fictional of himself. We will later discover that I see several sailing ships may not be best understood as short for it is fictional that I see several sailing ships, but our reasons will reinforce the world of the painting, of course, as the ships do, and the reader of Gulliver's Travel is not a character in the novel as Napoleon is a character in War and Peace. We need to recall the distinction between work novels, pictures, and plays, and the worlds of games of make-believe in which these works are props. Appreciators belong only to the latter. It is fictional in the game the reader plays with Gulliver's Travels, not in Gulliver's Travels itself, that she reads the journal of a ship's physician, and it is fictional in the viewer's game with Shore at Scheveningen that he sees ships offshore. The world of an appreciator's game includes fictional truth generated by all of its props, by the appreciator as well as by the work, and by relations among them. The work world includes only fictional truth generated by the work alone. It is Shore at Scheveningen fictional that there are ships offshore, that there is a horse caught on the beach and a dog swarming in the surf. When Stephen contemplates the painting, it is fictional in his game that all this is so, and in addition that he sees ships offshore and a dog in the surf. His game world is an expansion of the work world. There is nothing unusual about having distinct fictional worlds, one included within the other. Illustrations in novels and performances of plays, like appreciators, add to one fictional world to form a larger one. A picture of Raskolnikov illustrating Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment combines with the text to establish a world in which not only is it fictional that Raskolnikov killed an old lady and otherwise acted as the novel has him acting, but also it is fictional that he has the appearance the picture portrays him as having. What needs to be shown in order to establish that appreciators are reflexive props in their games of make-believe, that certain principles of make-believe are in force, ones whereby a person's reading of Gulliver's Travels, for instance, makes it fictional that she is reading the journal of a ship's physician, and whereby in looking at Shore at Scheveningen, Stephen makes it fictional that he sees ships. What principles are in force is a matter of what principles participants recognize or accept or take to be in force. This recognition or acceptance can be implicit, as we have seen. Principles need not be stated or formulated. Games launched by stipulation, let's say that slumps are bears, include principles that are unthinkingly, automatically assumed to be in force, that larger stumps count as larger bears, for instance. But there need not be even an initial stipulation. Children do not begin by saying, let this be a baby, each time they play dolls. The reader of Gulliver's Travels and the viewer of Shore at Scheveningen do not start their games with stipulations, and their understandings about the relevant principles of make-believe are almost entirely implicit. Let us recall also that games of make-believe need not be social affairs. Appreciators' games are usually rather personal. Although the work that serves as a prop is publicly recognized and appreciated by many, each appreciator ordinarily plays his own game with it. There are exceptions to this, but what is important now is simply that games of make-believe can be personal. They can be played and even recognized by only a single person. So my proposal does not require anyone other than the appreciator himself to recognize the relevant principles of make-believe. What needs to be shown, then, is that the reader of Gulliver's Travels, for example, recognizes or accepts, at least implicitly, a principle whereby her reading of the novel makes it fictional that she reads a ship's physician's journal, a principle according to which, given her actual reading, she is to imagine herself reading such a journal. We need to establish that Stephen accepts a principle whereby, given his observation of Shore at Scheveningen, he is to imagine himself looking at ships, a horse caught on the beach, and so on. I suspect that the painting causes more qualms than Gulliver's Travels does, so I will concentrate now on it. Not only is Stephen likely to remark that he sees ships offshore when he views Van der Velde's beachscape, but he may also make comments such as, I think I detect a trace of joy in the expression of the man on the cart, but he is too far away to see clearly. A seventh and an eighth ship are barely visible on the horizon, and look, there's a dog swimming in the surf. It seems undeniable that Stephen thinks of himself, imagines himself to be looking at a beach, ships in the ocean, and so on. And there is good reason to suppose that he understands this imagining to be called for, prescribed by his experience of looking at the painting. His act of imagination is not a deliberate or reflective one, but is triggered more or less automatically by his perception of the painting. He is simply disposed to think of himself as seeing ships, without deciding to do so when he sees the painting. This is just the sort of disposition which suggests implicit recognition of a principle of make-believe. If a child who comes across first a small stump and later a large one, both of which are bears in his game, is disposed automatically to imagine that he came across first a small bear and then a larger one. It will probably be reasonable to regard him as recognizing, implicitly, a principle correlating the size of fictional bears with that of the corresponding stumps. Stephen's tendency to imagine himself seeing ships when he looks at the picture is grounds for attributing to him acceptance of a principle whereby his seeing the picture makes it fictional that he sees ships. Support of a different kind can be derived from other remarks people make when looking at depictions, ones involving demonstratives. Stephen says, "That is a ship," pointing toward a ship depiction on the canvas. A person viewing a painting, film, or theatrical event may remark, while gesturing appropriately, "That child looks distressed. This is the king's armor. Someone is hidden in the shadows over there." It is not easy to see how such comments can be understood except on the hypothesis that the viewer is a reflexive prop in a game of make-believe, that he participates verbally in such a game. This argument, unlike the preceding one, has no obvious analogues applicable to literary representations. Consider Stephen's "That is a ship." This is clearly a perfectly appropriate thing for a viewer of show at Scheveningen to say, provided that he points in the right direction. Stephen would be open to correction had he said, "That is not a ship," while indicating the same spot on the canvas. The most obvious explanation of this appropriateness would be that Stephen is asserting something true. Assume for the moment that he is. What truth is he asserting? Before looking for an answer, we should note that it would not be appropriate for a reader of a novel about a ship to make an analogous comment. The reader of Moby Dick will not, in a similar spirit, remark, "That is a ship," while pointing toward the following passage, or some part of it. "She was a ship of the old school, rather small if anything, with an old-fashioned claw-footed look about her. Long-seasoned and weather-stained in the typhoons and calms of all four oceans, her old host complexion was darkened like a French grenadier's, who has alike fought in Egypt and Siberia. Her venerable bows looked bearded. Her masts..." Melville, Moby Dick, Chapter 16, The Ship. What does Stephen mean? Certainly he is not pointing out an actual ship. His words require a less straightforward interpretation. Should we regard them as preceded implicitly by "it is fictional that," or more colloquially, "it is true in the picture that"? Is Stephen claiming that the proposition his words express is fictional? But what proposition is this? His words appear to express a proposition about a particular thing, about something he indicates by pointing and saying "that." The suggestion is that he is asserting of this thing that fictionally it is a ship. But what thing? The painting, or the portion of it at which his finger is aimed? Is the claiming it to be fictional that this is a ship? If so, his claim is false. No part of the canvas is such that fictionally it is a ship. Pictures, as we have seen, do not ordinarily represent themselves. This suggestion clashes with our assumption that Stephen is expressing the truth. Does the demonstrative refer to a fictitious entity, assuming that there are such, one of the ships in the picture? Pointing to the relevant marks on the canvas might be a convenient way of indicating which fictitious thing one has in mind. Is Stephen saying either that this thing is fictionally a ship or that it really is one? But then why is it not appropriate to point to the text of Moby Dick and declare that is a ship? If there is an object in the picture which fictionally or actually is a ship, there is an object in the novel which is such also. Why shouldn't the reader specify this fictional object by pointing to an appropriate part of the text and assert that fictionally or actually it is a ship? There seems no other reasonable candidate for the referent of that. If Stephen is attributing fictionality to a proposition, it must not be a proposition about something picked out by his demonstrative. Is he claiming it to be fictional merely that there exists a ship? But then why did he use the demonstrative? This proposal is inadequate, in any case, for reasons that are clear from 3.8. Maybe Stephen is not attributing fictionality to anything. Could it be that that refers to the painting of part of it, and that Stephen is claiming this to be a ship representation? Is "that is a ship" short for "that is a ship representation"? This again leaves us in the dark about why a reader does not point to Moby Dick and say "that is a ship." Moby Dick is a ship representation too, to which one can refer by pointing. Granted, the picture and the novel are different kinds of representations. "That is a ship" might conceivably mean that is a picture of a ship picture. But then we need an explanation of why ship should sometimes abbreviate picture of a ship, but never novel about a ship. It is time for a more radical proposal. Perhaps Stephen is neither referring to anything nor attributing fictionality to anything. We may even have been too hasty in assuming that he's asserting something true or anything at all. Things fall neatly into place if we suppose that Stephen is merely pretending to refer to something and to claim it to be a ship. This frees us from the supposition that his demonstrative actually picks anything out, or even that there is anything to which he pretends to refer. He only pretends that there is something which he refers to and calls a ship. Yet his use of that is easily explained. In pretending, one copies the behavior one pretends to be engaging in. In pretending to refer, one naturally uses words and gestures, demonstratives and pointings, for instance, that are ordinarily used in referring. We are freed also from the obligation to find a truth that Stephen asserts, or for that matter a falsehood, or even a proposition, true or false, that he pretends to assert. That is, a ship does not express a proposition. Stephen only pretends that it does. Stephen is not trying to fool anyone, of course, when he pretends. The sense of pretense relevant here is to be explained in terms of make-believe. In saying that is a ship, Stephen makes it fictional that he's referring to something and claiming it to be a ship. This is a fictional truth about Stephen, one that belongs to the game he plays with the picture. He is a reflexive prop in that game. To pretend in the sense in question is to participate verbally in a game of make-believe. We do have to make sense of the appropriateness of Stephen's remark and the corresponding inappropriateness of "that is not a ship," said while indicating the same part of the canvas. It was in order to explain this what we provisionally accepted the idea that Stephen was saying something true, but it can be explained by the fact that it is fictional that Stephen expresses a truth, whereas to say "that is not a ship" would be, fictionally, to express a falsehood. It is usually appropriate to act so as fictionally to speak the truth. Granted, one might respond, "That's true," to Stephen's utterance, or not so if he should say, "That is not a ship." But these responses may be acts of pretense themselves. It may be fictional that one pronounces Stephen to have spoken the truth, or to have spoken falsely. It is possible that Stephen is really asserting something, in addition to pretending to do so, and what he really asserts may be true. In 10.3 we shall consider what it is that he might really be asserting. Answering this question will be much easier than it seemed earlier. We now realize that there is no reason to expect his assertion to be about something he refers to by that. Stephen's pretense already sufficiently explains his use of the demonstrative. Why is it inappropriate for the reader of Moby Dick, pointing towards certain parts of the text, to remark, "That is a ship"? Because the games we play with novels are of a different kind from those we play with pictures. It is not fictional of the reader that he sees a ship, or that there is one before him. Probably it is fictional, instead, that he hears told of a ship. So pointing to the text does not make it fictional that one points to a ship. Verbal participation. There is no denying the pervasiveness of verbal participation in children's game. "Stick 'em up," says a child pretending to rob a bank. His getaway is forged when another child shouts, "Stop, thief," and fictionally carts him off to jail. "Careful, there's a bear in the thicket behind you," Eric exclaims, fictionally warning Susan of a dangerous bear. We should expect appreciators to participate verbally in their games with representational works of art as well. Nothing is more natural than for Stephen to pretend to point out a ship by remarking, "That is a ship," and we should not be surprised if, in saying things like "There are several ships offshore," Gulliver was captured by the Lilliputians, and Ivan was furious with Smerdyakov It is sometimes fictional that one is recounting events or reporting on states of affairs. We shall see in Chapter 10 then that this mode of participation is more common than one might suppose, and that the possibility of participating verbally underlies much of our discourse concerning representations, even when we are not actually doing so. Let us note now that in so far as such discourse constitutes verbal participation, in so far as what is said in pretense, however serious it might also be, one puzzle broached evaporates. Why do we so often say simply, there are several ships offshore, or a society of 6-inch tall people was living in a strange land, when what we seem to mean is merely that this is so in the world of shore at Scheveningen or in Gulliver's Travels? We may be pretending to assert seriously what we say. One would hardly expect a person pretending to claim that there really are several ships offshore to say there are ships offshore in the world of the picture. Again, pretenders copy the behavior that they pretend to be engaging in, and they tend to avoid blatantly displaying the fact that they are just pretending. There are ships offshore is exactly what we should expect a person to say if he is playing a game of make-believe in which, fictionally, he remarks on the presence of ships offshore. If a German speaker, in uttering Robinson Crusoe, is pretending to assert that a certain Robinson Crusoe survived a shipwreck, naturally he uses the indicative mood, the mood of assertion. He speaks as he would if he were actually asserting this. Not all discourse about representational works of art is pretense, even in part, however. Surely critics delivering dry lectures of academic commentary and esoteric analysis are not usually engaging in make-believe. Yet fictionality operators are commonly omitted even then. That is a ship might well be said in even the most sober criticism, when the speaker cannot easily be construed as pretending to point out an actual ship. This should be taken as a hint that make-believe is somehow in the background in critical discourse about representations, even when the speaker is not actually engaging in it. What the critic is analyzing or commenting on, after all, is something whose function is to serve as a prop in games of make-believe. We shall see how this is so. Fictionality operators are not the only ones that are sometimes left implicit, although they are omitted more commonly than most. On Ike Island, the fishermen are killing the dolphins annually now. The fish catch of the region is declining, and so the fishermen, cursing their luck, blame the dolphins. It doesn't matter that the area is overfished, or that pollutants dumped by industry have destroyed breeding grounds, or that worldwide fish catches are down as a consequence of man's rapaciousness. On Ike, as elsewhere throughout the world, the dolphins are to blame and so are put to death. Fundraising letter for Greenpeace USA, signed Susan Fountain for the men and women of Greenpeace, undated. Obviously, we are not to understand the writer herself to be claiming that the dolphins are to blame or that the overfishing and pollution don't matter. She is saying or suggesting that the fishermen claim or believe this, or perhaps that they act as though they do. But the omission of they believe claim that is not a mere abbreviation. The paragraph loses its heavy irony when such phrases are inserted. It doesn't matter that the area is overfished. They believe, claim, or that pollutants dumped by industry have destroyed breeding. The dolphins are to blame, they think, say, and so are put to death. The writer of the original version is not just using an economical form of words to describe the fishermen's beliefs or assertions. She is describing them by pretending to endorse the ideas she attributes to them, no doubt with exaggeration. This suggests a general account of irony, and one variety of irony anyway, in terms of pretense. To speak ironically is to mimic or mock those one disagrees with. Fictionally, to assert what they do or might assert. Irony is sarcasm. One shows what it is like to make certain claims, hoping thereby to demonstrate how absurd or ridiculous it is to do so. Clark and Gehrig propose an account of irony along these lines in Pretense Theory of Irony. Call this a government. Why, just look at it and see what it's like. Here's the law standing ready to take a man's son away from him, a man's own son. Oh yes, this is a wonderful government, wonderful. Papin Twain, Huckleberry Finn, Chapter 6, page 49. Pap is mimicking, mocking, sneering at those who do seriously call it a government, and a wonderful one, although he does not specify who they are. In Gashamarka's story, The Incredible and Sad Tale of Innocent Erendira and Her Heartless Grandmother, Erendira escapes in the middle of the night from the tent where her tyrannical grandmother kept her. But she hadn't taken 5 steps outside the tent when she came across the, photograph, the photographer, who was lashing his equipment to the carrier of his bicycle. His accomplice's smile calmed her down. "I don't know anything," the photographer said. "I haven't seen anything I won't pay for, and I won't pay for the music." Innocent manner. Rather than claiming seriously that he did not see the escape or know about it, the photographer is demonstrating what he will say later to the grandmother. He might be understood to be mimicking the assertion he intends to make, pretending or pretending to pretend, to claim that he did not witness the escape as a means of assuring Erendira that he will say this to the grandmother. Hence the omission of "I will tell her that." One might indicate that those who postulated the existence of a planet Vulcan believed it to have mass m by saying simply, "Vulcan had mass m." Here too there may be a hint of more of mimicry. It is not easy to find cases in which phrases like "Jones wishes that" and "it is doubted that" are omitted but might plausibly be said to be understood. One does not say "God will rain from the sky" as a way of asserting that Jones wishes God would rain from the sky. This may be because there is no actual or envisioned serious utterance of that sentence for the speaker to mimic. His point is not one that could naturally be made by pretending to assert that gold will rain from the sky, thereby showing that what Jones does or might actually assert. Although the propensity to omit certain operators is often explained by the fact that the speaker pretends seriously to assert what he says, such pretense can occur even when the operators are present. This is so in some instances of reported speech. In cases of direct quotation, he said, the quoter indicates what words the quoted person used by uttering them himself. But he may also demonstrate, what the other person claimed seriously by means of his words and the attitudes he expressed, by pretending to make that claim or express those attitudes himself. This will be evident when the quoter mimics or mocks the quoted person's tone of voice, inflection, emphasis. In quoting a person indirectly, he said that one does not use the very words he did, but it may be fictional that one endorses a certain thought, thereby indicating that the quoted person, using his own words, endorsed it. Such participation may occupy less than whole sentences, even a single word or phrase. In saying Tom proposed that President X, the greatest president of the century, should have his image carved in Mount Rushmore, one may be pretending to tout X as the greatest president of the century, thus portraying the quoted person as doing so. The scare quotes or an obviously exaggerated, sarcastic tone of voice serve both to make it clear that the speaker is engaging in this pretense and to betray it, to indicate that one is only pretending. He said, are also devices of betrayal, when there is pretense to betray. But sometimes the pretense is not betrayed in this way. One may say merely, Vulcan has mass M or X was the greatest president of the century, perhaps pretending to assert it seriously as a way of indicating what someone else asserted or believes. The games of make-believe in which one participates verbally in these last cases are ones that have no connection with representational works of art or works of fiction. They illustrate the pervasiveness of our propensity to engage in make-believe, and they point toward the account of existence claims I will propose in Chapter N, many of which have nothing to do with such works. But more needs to be said about the ways in which appreciators participate in their games with pictures, novels, plays, and films, and the ways in which they do not. Restrictions on participation. So far, we have readers and spectators of representational works of art participating in activities analogous to children's games of make-believe. Some may still be uncomfortable with the analogy. An adult curled up in an armchair with a novel or standing transfixed before a painting seems hardly to be participating in a game in the way children do when they play dolls or gallop around the house straddling sticks. Appreciators are passive, reflective, and distanced, it may seem, while children are active, physical, and involved. We have seen already that in addition to participating in games of make-believe, appreciators observe fictional worlds to which they do not belong, the worlds of the works they appreciate. Children are usually concerned only with the worlds of their games. If props like dolls and sticks have worlds too, ones analogous to work worlds, they are not often very interesting. But beyond this, there are significant differences in the nature and existence of children's and appreciators' participation. The participation of appreciators is restricted in ways in which that of children is not. We need to look carefully at all these restrictions, both because they are important in themselves and to counteract their tendency to obscure the justice of the basic analogy between appreciation and the playing of children's games. It is essential to see the differences as differences of degree. It may be fictional of Lauren, when she plays with dolls, that she bathes or feeds or dresses a baby. No one fictionally bathes or feeds or dresses a child while viewing Rubens, Ellen Formant, and her children. It may be fictional in a game of dolls that a baby is hugged or carried or praised or reproved, or left at home while Lauren goes shopping, or discovered under a sofa, and so on, depending on what Lauren or other children actually do with or to the dolls. Nothing a viewer does with or to a picture will, ordinarily, make it fictional that he treats a child in any of these ways. By carrying a doll to her friend's house, Lauren fictionally takes a baby there. Moving Antoine Gros Napoleon at Hello from the Louvre to the Metropolitan Museum would not count as fictionally transporting Napoleon and a number of his troops, not to mention the building and fields shown in the background, across the Atlantic. It is fictional in any normal game played with the painting that Napoleon is at Hello, no matter where the painting is. Games played by spectators of paintings are restricted in two ways compared with children's games. There are fewer sorts of actions such that it can be fictional that the spectator performs them, and fewer actions which the spectator might actually perform are easily interpretable as contributions to the game, as generating fictional truth. Games played by appreciators of plays, poems, novels, and other works are restricted in similar ways, although the details vary from case to case. Some restrictions are due to the nature of the props. Picking up a doll by its arms is naturally understood as fictionally lifting a baby by its arms, but Rubens' painting does not have similarly graspable arms. Other restrictions may be more conventional. It is, I suppose, a convention of traditional theatre that spectators are not to jump onto the stage, and that if one should do so, he is not to be understood as fictionally saving anyone or as fictionally doing anything at all. We could easily understand having a principle of generation whereby talking in a certain tone of voice in front of a painting counts as fictionally talking to a baby, or a principle on which by kissing a certain spot on a canvas one makes it fictional that one kisses a baby. But it is not the function of works like Rubens' painting to serve as props in games of this kind. Such participation may be expected in games with religious icons, however. Children's games have limitations also, though usually less extensive ones. It is not easy, in a game of stump bears, for Eric to arrange for it to be fictional that a bear chases him home or that he scares one away by banging on pots. The stump just will not cooperate. Of course, he would abandon the prop and merely imagine such occurrences. Lauren might, fictionally, hold a child while it practices walking, but without a fancy mechanical doll, she cannot very conveniently make it fictional that a child learns to walk on its own. The limitations on appreciators' games do not prevent them from being immensely rich and varied. The participation of the spectators of Vermeer's girl reading letter by open window goes far beyond his fictional observing a girl reading a letter. It may be fictional that he notices her reflection in the window, or fails to notice it, that he glances in passing at the fruits of the foreground, or studies them intently, that he identifies them or counts them, that he examines the expression on the girl's face for clues about the content of the letter. He may fictionally point to the drape hanging over the window or to ornaments on the chair in the corner. It may be fictional that he remarks on what he knows or discusses with someone what might be in the letter or where the fruit might have grown. It is fictional of the reader of Gulliver's Travels, not only that she reads the journal of a ship's physician about a series of adventures in strange lands, but also that she reads quickly or slowly, with rapt attention or indifference, that she skims over details or commits them to memory. In both cases, there will be psychological participation. It will be fictional that the appreciator has thoughts and feelings, opinions and attitudes of one or another sort concerning what he or she sees or reads about. We have noted sharp contrasts between the activity of appreciating girl reading letter or Gulliver's Travels in normal ways and that of children playing dolls and similar games of make believe. There are many intermediate cases, however, games with some hurt not all of the restriction imposed on the former activities. Some of them are games of standard, established, traditional kinds. Others are improvised and ad hoc. Consideration of these intermediate cases and of the ease with which restrictions on participation in appreciators' games can be relaxed will encourage regarding the differences as differences of degree. Sculptures often allow for games that are in some ways less restricted than the ones we play with pictures. To walk behind a portrait is probably not to make it fictional that one walks behind a person. But this is fictional, probably, when one walks behind around Michelangelo's David. Caressing a sculpture of a person, or even a painting, can easily be understood as fictionally caressing a person. Even if convention does not sanction this understanding and snippy museum guards discourage the behavior. It is almost impossible not to regard throwing darts at the portrait or sticking pins into it as fictionally attacking the person portrayed. It is not easy to bring oneself to stick pins into the portrait of a loved one. The Richard J. Daly exhibition at the Fagan Gallery in Chicago in 1968 included Tattered Image by James Rosenquist, a pink and white plastic picture of Daly slit vertically into ribbons. Spectators shoved their fists through the picture, of course, fictionally punching Daly. Children sometimes treat pictures like dolls or teddy bears, feeding picture tigers and taking them to bed with them, for example, or sitting on pictures of fire engines in order to ride on them. These are unconventional games to play with pictures, but they are easily understood. Several of these examples are altered versions of games ordinarily played with representations. They are like those normal ones except for the addition of certain sorts of overt physical participation. It would be hard to account for the naturalness of the variance if the normal games did not themselves involve some participation of the kind that occurs in games of dolls and other such children's games. How could it be so obvious that to put one's fist through tattered image is fictionally to punch daily if it were not already fictional, just by virtue of the fact that the person is standing in front of the picture, that she is standing in front of daily, if she were not already participating in a game of make believe? The activities of appreciating representations in normal ways are best seen as truncated variants of children's games of make believe. Why do we put up with the restrictions? We could, after all, be down on the floor playing dolls instead of looking at pictures and reading novels. It must not be assumed that restrictions on appreciators' games are disadvantages, that it is always or even usually better to play games that allow for more extensive participation. There are benefits in the limitations. Appreciators' games are typically less physical than children's, but more reflective, more contemplative. The restrictions on physical participation shift the emphasis to psychological participation. The convention that prevents Harry, Henry's more sophisticated brother, from leaping to the defense of a damsel in distress may result in his reflecting more deeply on her predicament. He does not interrupt his reflections to intervene, nor do Rory's about whether he should fictionally intervene intrude. Since the game is such that it cannot be fictional that he intervenes, it is likely to involve a richer collection of fictional truth about his thoughts and feelings. He also has ample opportunity for actually reflecting on what, fictionally, he thinks and feels. A second advantage that limitations on appreciators' participation may have is that of expanding the contributions the artist makes to their games. Much of what is fictional in appreciators' games is determined by the work appreciated and by the artist responsible for it. But the artist's role can conflict with participation. If by writing or painting in a certain way an artist is to arrange for it to be fictional in appreciator's game that an accused murderer stands ramrod straight, defiantly, before a judge throughout his trial, the games can hardly be ones in which an appreciator can make it fictional that the badgers the accused into confessing, or helps him to escape, or disrupts the courtroom. Artists make valuable contributions to our games. We benefit from their experience, wisdom, and insight. but we must accept corresponding restrictions to our own participation. The advantages are not all on one side. Playing a game in which the participants themselves, not artists or prop makers, are responsible for the principal fictional truth is like exploring or experimenting on one's own. In some ways and in some situations, this is better than relying on a wise teacher. To allow that restrictions on participation are sometimes desirable is not to diminish the role of the participation that does occur. What is important is not simply the fact that fictionally an accused murderer comports himself in a certain manner at his trial, for example, a fictional truth for which the artist is responsible, but the fact that fictionally the appreciator sees him comport himself that way or knows that he does, and has thoughts or feelings of one or another sort about his doing so. These fictional truths are generated by the appreciator and the artist in collaboration, by the appreciators participating in a game in which the artist's work is a prop. One common kind of limitation on appreciators' participation has not yet been mentioned. When it is violated or suspended or just absent, we have what I will call an aside to the audience. Asides to the audience. It is fictional that the viewer of La Grande Jatte sees people strolling in a park. But it is not fictional that they see him. The spectator of a performance of Ibsen's Hedda Gabler fictionally hears Hedda speak, but it is not fictional that he addresses him or speaks to him. It is not commonly fictional in our games with representational works that characters notice or respond to us, or that we exchange glances with them or hold conversations with them. But there are exceptions. I don't know if you happen to take old Dr. Gordon's bile magnesia, which, when the liver is disordered, gives instant relief, acting like magic and imparting an inward glow. Thus does the narrator of P.G. Wodehouse's How Right You Are, Jeeves, speak to the reader. If the actor playing Balthazar looks toward the spectators in delivering the following lines, it is fictional that Balthazar addresses them. Romeo, so shalt thou show me friendship, take thou that. Live and be prosperous, and farewell, good fellow. Balthazar, aside, for all this same, I'll hide me hereabout. His looks I fear, and his intents I doubt. Caravaggio's Bacchus offers a drink to the viewer. The first Western, The Great Train Robbery, ends with a shot in which a bandit aims a revolver at the camera and fires. There are occasions in film and theatre when a character suddenly turns to the spectator to ask advice or appeal for sympathy. For example, in Tom Jones, Tony Richardson, and The Magic Flute. There is the First World War recruitment poster captioned, Uncle Sam needs you. Let us speak of asides to the audience, or just asides. There are what are called asides which are not to the audience, as when Balthazar speaks his lines gazing at the sky, but they won't concern us now. In cases like this, altering somewhat the usual application of this phrase, asides are not always easy to diagnose. The presence of second-person pronouns or dear reader in a literary work is no sure indication, nor is it necessary, witness the Romeo and Juliet example. The author can actually address the reader as Apuleius does in The Golden Ass. In the Milesian tale, reader, I shall string together a medley of stories and titillate your agreeable ears with a merrily whispered narrative, if you will not refuse to scan this Egyptian paper written with a subtle pen of Nilotic reeds. As a Thackeray appears to do in Vanity Fair. See the passage quoted in 7.3. I continue, yes. Groucho Marx stops in the middle of animal crackers to remark approximately, well, the jokes can't all be funny. You gotta expect that once in a while. If the reader is actually being addressed, occurrences of you in the text need not indicate that it is fictional that he is. But in instances like these, we might attribute the words to a fictional storyteller. We might understand it to be fictional in the game played by the reader of Vanity Fair that he is addressed by a storyteller, who then proceeds to tell his tale of harrowing villainy and complicated crime. This gives us an aside after all. It may of course be both fictional and true that the reader is addressed, and it may be the actual author who fictionally addresses him. In epistolary novels, second-person pronouns are likely to refer not to the actual reader of the novel, but to the character to whom the letter is written. It may not be fictional that the novel reader is addressed, but perhaps the reader of Flotsam needs to imagine himself to be among the friends to whom Marlowe recounts his experiences. John Barth gives us an especially intriguing example in the following paragraph. In Life Story, page 123. The reader, you dogged, unsuitable, print-oriented bastard. It's you I'm addressing. Who else from inside this monstrous fiction? You've read me this far, then, even this far, for what discreditable motive? How is it you don't go to a movie, watch TV, stare at a wall, play tennis with a friend, make amorous advances to the person who comes to your mind when I speak of amorous advances? Can nothing so saturate you, turn you off? Where's your shame? The actual reader of Bart's story may well feel himself the target of this tirade. If it is from inside a fiction that he is being addressed, this presumably means that it is fictional that he is addressed, and we have an aside. We will just have to swallow the paradox that fictionally the speaker recognizes the fiction within which he speaks. But this paragraph is to be understood as occurring within quotations. For Barth continues, having let go this barrage of rhetorical or at least unanswered questions and observing himself, nevertheless, in the midst of yet another sentence, he concluded, so it is not fictional in my game with life story that the words the reader, you dogged, insutable, print-oriented bastard, are directed to me, but rather, apparently, that they are part of a story. It is merely fictional that there is an aside. It is life story fictional that there is a story. It's such that it would be fictional in games played by its readers that they are addressed. There are other possibilities, however. It may be that, to speak intuitively, it is the actual reader of Bart's story, you or I, who is addressed from inside the story within the story. Here are a couple of stabs at what this might mean. A. It is fictional in my game with life story, that I read a paragraph quoted from a story, and that in doing so I play a game in which fictionally I am addressed. Again, it is only fictional that there is an aside, but it is fictional that there is an aside directed to me. B. In reading the reader, you dogged, uninsultable, I am really playing a game, one distinct from the game I play with the story as a whole, in which it is fictional that I am addressed. So the paragraph taken alone really does contain an aside directed to me. But it is life story fictional that this paragraph, together with its aside, occurs in the story and is directed to whoever should read that story. We do not encounter quite the same difficulties in identifying asides to the audience in the visual arts. It is hard to imagine a viewer of a painting confusing its being fictional that Vegas or a bandit notices him or offers him a drink or aims a gun at him with the painters actually doing so. There are other difficulties, however. We will come upon one shortly. But let's focus on relatively unproblematic cases first. I'll close my window. Asides can be singular or plural. It is fictional in the game played by a viewer of the great train robbery that a bandit aims a gun at him alone, but Balthazar may speak to the audience as a whole. We might think of the spectators of Romeo and Juliet as participating in a single joint game of make-believe, one in which it is fictional that Balthazar addresses them all collectively. But it is usually best to understand each individual spectator of a movie as engaging in his own private game. The darkness of the theatre encourages this also. It is fictional in the game each spectator of the great train robbery plays that a gun is aimed directly at him, but it is not fictional in any game that a gun is aimed directly at all of the spectators at once. This highlights a significant difference between film and theatre. An actor on stage cannot aim a gun at or establish eye contact with each spectator simultaneously. An actor in film can. Asides can be plural even if the games of make-believe are individual. When Dostoevsky's Underground Man says, "And so in the end, ladies and gentlemen, it's best to do nothing at all," notes from the underground. It is not fictional in any normal game that he is addressing all of the actual readers of Notes from the Underground collectively. It is fictional in each reader's game that he addresses a group of people to which the reader belongs. Asides are not rare, but in many contexts they are special. One is taken aback by Baker's offer of a drink. It is disconcerting, if pleasantly so, to go to a movie and be recognized from the screen. There is something surprising, striking about many asides. They mark an important shift in one's relation to the fiction. Some will say that asides bring the appreciator into the fiction, that we suddenly feel ourselves included in a fictional world in a way in which normally we are not. Asides do involve appreciators in the worlds of their games. It is fictional that the reader or spectator is noticed or addressed or offered a drink or threatened, but appreciators belong to their game worlds anyway, even without any such device. The naturalness of the sides, our readiness to understand that fictionally someone notices or speaks to us, even if we are surprised that this should be fictional, supports this claim. When it is fictional that someone looks in a certain direction or uses second person pronouns, why do we so readily understand it to be fictional that he notices or addresses us, unless it is fictional already that we are there to be noticed or addressed? But if we do belong to our game worlds anyway, why should there be anything special or remarkable about asides? Part of the answer lies simply in the fact that being recognized or addressed in real life marks a significant change in one's social situation. Think of a student suddenly called on in class or a lecturer picking out someone in the upper gallery and speaking specifically to him. One feels included in a manner one wasn't previously. An aside makes it fictional that the appreciator is included similarly. This change may be important, but it doesn't consist in the appreciator suddenly being drawn into a fictional world to which until then he did not belong. The special poignancy of many asides is to be explained in part, however, by restrictions against them. In many contexts they are deliberately avoided. Sometimes they are more or less explicitly forbidden. Hence, for example, the usual instructions to novice film actors not to look at the camera. Michael Fried has documented Diderot's condemnation of most asides to the audience in theatre and painting as in poor taste, and the preference of painters such as Jean-Baptiste Siméon Chardin and Jean-Baptiste Greuze for figures absorbed in what they are doing and oblivious to everything else, notably refusing to acknowledge the beholder's presence. Freed absorption and theatricality. The leading actors arrive with careful, measured steps. They seek applause, they depart from the action, they address themselves to the audience, they talk to it and become dull and false. Diderot Discourse, quoted and translated in Freed. Asides are especially striking when they are unexpected or forbidden, of course. The surprise is sometimes not unlike that which attends the violation of other conventions, a small patch of color in an otherwise black and white sketch, for instance. Diderot seems to think of the beholder as belonging to a fictional world together with the characters, even when they do not recognize him. In explaining why in a painting of Susanna and the elders no one is offended by Susanna, who covers herself with all her veils, from the elder's view while exposing herself entirely to the eyes of the beholder, he observes, "It is the difference between a woman who is seen and a woman who exhibits herself." Although, as Fried notes, the woman in Creuse, Jeune fille qui pleure son oiseau mort, is wholly absorbed in an extreme state and oblivious to all else, Diderot remarks that soon one catches oneself conversing with this child and consoling her, and reports what he remembers having said to her on various occasions. "There, there, my child, open up your heart to me." Not all asides are equally special or equally disconcerting. Subjects or portraits can look at the viewer without raising eyebrows. There is nothing especially noteworthy about the fact that the gentlemen in Hans Holbein's painting the ambassadors appear to be looking out at us. The most obvious explanation is that in portraiture, or portraiture of certain kinds, there is no restriction against asides. They may even be more or less obligatory. More nakedly and, as it were, categorically than the conventions of any other genre, those of the portrait call for exhibiting a subject, the sitter, to the public gaze. Put another way, the basic action depicted in a portrait in the sitter's presentation of himself or herself to be heralded. Hence the unremarkableness of the fact that fictionally the ambassadors notice us. But the ambassadors can be understood not to involve asides at all. It may be expected in portraits of certain kinds that a sitter will be made to look straight ahead, to focus, as it were, on the spot where viewers will stand. And because this is expected, it may not be understood to be fictional that the sitter notices the viewer. He looks in the direction he does not because he has caught sight of the viewer, so to speak, but simply because that is the way portraits of that kind are painted. I do not think there is a definitive answer as to which of these two construals of works like The Ambassadors is correct. Asides make for moments of interaction within the appreciator's game world between him and one or more of the work's characters. But only moments. The interaction remains severely limited. It is rarely fictional that the appreciator carries on an extended conversation with a character, or that he and a character make eyes at each other or exchange more than a glance or two. Italo Calvino's "If on a winter's night a traveller" is a long, extended aside. It is fictional in the reader's game that he is addressed constantly during his reading. But there still is little interaction. It is not often fictional that the reader and narrator respond very much to each other or that they converse together. Even when it is fictional that the reader speaks and the narrator replies, it is the words of the text, not what the reader actually says, that determine what fictionally he says. When Calvino writes, "I prefer novels," she adds, "that bring me immediately into a world where everything is precise, concrete, specific. Do you agree? Then say no. Ah, yes, that sort of book is really worthwhile. He is putting words into the reader's mouth. Contrast children's games. It is because Gregory actually says, 'Watch out for the bear,' that fictionally he says this." There is an obvious practical reason for these limits. When the artist constructs her work, she determines once and for all what fictionally her characters say and do. But different appreciators will behave differently in front of the work. What fictionally they say and do, what they choose to attend to and how, what they mutter under their breath will vary greatly, and some will behave in ways the artist did not foresee. So the artist cannot fit her character's responses to what, fictionally, the appreciator says or does. She cannot customize the work for the game any particular appreciator might play with it. This can be done in improvisational theater. It is no accident that improvisation and audience participation often go together. There is also interactive fiction for computers. If fictionally Papageno in Bergman's rendition of Mozart's opera appeals to the appreciator for sympathy, it may be fictional that the appreciator willingly complies, or that he brushes off the request with disdain, or that he ignores it. What should the artist, Mozart or Bergman, have Papageno do now? Should he make it fictional that Papageno breaks down in tears of gratitude, or that he spits in the spectator's eye? Rather than risk an inappropriate reaction, or an appropriate one, if the artist prefers it to be fictional that the character responds inappropriately, the interaction is cut off. Cutting off interaction after an aside can be awkward. If care is not taken to do it cleanly, it may be unclear when the aside ends. We may be uncertain, for example, whether it is fictional that Papageno deliberately ignores whatever response we make to his request, or whether it merely fails to be fictional that he acknowledges it. It may seem simpler, to have no interaction at all, not to allow it to be fictional that the appreciator is noticed or addressed in the first place. Hence the restriction against asides. One effect on this restriction and of limitations on participation generally is to give the appreciator a kind of objective, distanced perspective on the world of his game. Questions about what fictionally others think of him, how they do or might react to him, what might be demanded of him recede into the background, as do questions about how fictionally he might or should try to influence events. Indeterminacy concerning certain aspects of his place in the game world typically goes with the restrictions. Nothing much is to be said about why the strollers in La Grangette fail to notice me, assuming it to be fictional that they do not notice me, not fictional that they do. It is not fictional that they deliberately ignore me, or that they absent-mindedly overlook me. We will not comfortably affirm that fictionally they are too preoccupied with other things to notice me, or that the explanation is none of the above. Some such answer may be less artificial than others. Not all such questions dissolve in an indeterminacy. Why don't the men in Peter Bruegel's parable of the blind notice the viewer? Because they are blind, obviously. It may be fictional in the viewer's game with jeune fille that the girl does not see him because she is absorbed in her grief, but it probably is not fictional that the viewer would have been noticed if the men weren't blind or the girl weren't absorbed in grief, or for that matter that he would not have been noticed even in those circumstances. Where was I? Even so, the question is out of place. Silly. The appreciator does not ask why fictionally no one pays any attention to him, and it is not fictional that he wonders why no one does or that he tries to come up with an explanation. Since convention forbids Harry to come to the assistance of the unfortunate heroine, Harry prevents it from being fictional that he does, there is probably no saying what, fictionally, his reason for not doing so was. Neither, I think, is it fictional that the thought of intervening simply did not occur to him. After all, it is fictional that he is desperately concerned about her plight and feels deeply for her. There is little room for questions about whether he ought to get involved or how he might do so or what people would think of him if he did or if he didn't. It won't be fictional that he kicks himself afterwards for not helping, or makes excuses for his inaction, or feels guilty or justified. Harry may reflect on whether, in real life, he would or should go to the aid of a woman in similar straits, but this is different. The appreciator is thus encouraged to concentrate on fictional truths about what the characters are up to, the predicaments they find themselves in, and what they think and feel. It is important, also, what fictionally he thinks and feels about them, but in abstraction to a certain extent from how they do or might affect him. Charles' confrontation with the slime, involving an aside as it does, is unusual in this respect. This allows the appreciator a kind of empathy with the characters, an ability to look at things more purely from their points of view, from a perspective relatively uncontaminated by his own personal concerns. The objectivity of this perspective contributes, no doubt, to the impression some may have that appreciators do not ordinarily belong to fictional worlds at all, that, in the absence of asides anyway, they merely observe from without. This impression is mistaken, but we can think of the appreciator as having, usually, a rather sketchy or a ghostly presence in the world of his game, in light of the restrictions on his role in it and the indeterminacy that often results from them. Asides disturb this objectivity momentarily and reduce the indeterminacy. They do not introduce the appreciator into a fictional world he did not previously or would not otherwise belong to, but they do give him a slightly fuller presence in the world of his game.